Hello and welcome, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at Café con Leche. And I hope to see you for some conversation after. So I'm going to share a little bit about a research project, collaborative research project that I've been working on. Um, and I hope others can appreciate some of the same aspects about this project and community work, because I'm really excited to talk to y'all about it. Um, for context, my name is Carrie Diaz Eaton. I'm an associate professor at Bates College. I am on sabbatical this year, so I have a number of research projects that I'm taking on. And when I was approached to talk at Café con Leche, I thought, which project am I going to talk about? And it came at the perfect timing. I just finished a residency at one of the math institutes, the Institute for Mathematical and Statistical Innovation in University of Chicago. And it was an opportunity to launch a particular project with a community group that I had started building relationships with last summer when I was in Providence at a different math institute at ISERM, the Institute for Computational Experimental Research in Mathematics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this collaboration in the context of what it means to be working on data science problems that are really motivated and driven by community needs. This is group work. I think you can see all of the folks who were at IMSI with me. There's a large group of people that this collaboration has been with. And so I just want to do a shout out to all of those. Really excited about this work and the work ahead. So I'm going to talk about the community partner and context of the project. That's Nuevas Voces. I'm going to talk about what it means to build relationships with community partners, the process of creating solutions for their needs, and what that meant from a mathematical, computational, data science perspective, and then talk a little bit about where we are in this project and the next directions that we see. Okay, context. So I mentioned that this work started with some relationship building while I was in residence at ISERM last summer. I'm going to take an extra step back. Part of what I wanted to do with my sabbatical was to really connect my social justice activism grounded in the community I grew up in outside of Providence, Rhode Island, with my identities as a mathematics researcher, and somebody who's on sabbatical to presumably improve their mathematical practices and learn more. And when I was going on sabbatical, I said, what a great opportunity to propose research to be undertaken in Providence, because I get to go back to that hometown. I get to sort of synthesize those physically together. But it was really a process to think about how to synthesize those in an actionable way. Just because I'm in a place does not mean that I'm really connecting with advocacy and activism in that place. So I do have some connections in Rhode Island. We used some of those connections. We used connections from my collaborators, and we started meeting with a lot of community groups. Anybody want to work with mathematicians? How can mathematicians help you? Just having these conversations, getting to know each other, and talking with each other about why we wanted to do this community engaged work, because we wanted to make a difference in the place that we were. And my sister happens to still live in Rhode Island. And she had been working with an organization called the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council. So the Woonasquatucket, this is Providence. This is Brown University. This is about where ISERM is located. And the city of Providence is much larger than the piece that you see here. And in fact, even this part of Providence is much larger than the piece you see here. All of these are neighborhoods within Providence. This is the ocean out here, and you'll see this river that runs along here. This is called the Woonasquatucket. So this is a organization, a nonprofit that helps manage some research, some restoration efforts, and some community advocacy programs along this area. You'll notice some interesting features. Maybe if you're looking at this map, you'll see the Consulate General of Guatemala very prominently displayed. I didn't do any kind of search for that. That's a place of note and interest in Providence. You'll also see Mi Guatemala. That's a restaurant, different. But it might lead you to believe that there, and rightfully so, that there is a large Hispanic and Latino population living in Providence, and that's definitely true. And the vast, there are many neighborhoods, but one of the neighborhoods that runs along this Woonasquatucket River, Olneyville, is a pretty low income neighborhood with a lot of folks who have recently immigrated, may have unstable citizenship status, mostly Spanish speaking, but not exclusively. I mean, there's a good number of folks who come with their own indigenous languages from Central America and South America as well. And there's, when you think about these areas of town that don't have the kinds of resources that, say, Brown University does, you can imagine that their physical neighborhood is also in some sense under attack, whether it's, landlords that are not the best, or infrastructure really wearing down, not a lot of attention, where are the new paved roads or the new paved roads over here in the neighborhoods? I will say, yes, there are a lot of new paved roads over by Brown University. They're not necessarily here. But another sort of issue is that flooding has been a real problem. So this is where Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council comes in. So climate change certainly has exacerbated the frequency of potential flooding issues. Flooding for a long time, though, in Rhode Island was considered something that was really a coastal community issue. And we can see even the inner of Providence is affected by the coast because of the Woonasquatucket, but also infrastructure, it's not great, not kept up, and it exacerbates any kind of issues that would have been present with climate change. So Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council came up with this advocacy program to work to help support community residents in the Olneyville neighborhood to advocate for their neighborhood. They had their first cohort in 2021. This was completely virtual experience with 20 members. They had a grant to run this. I'll point out there's Maria Jose, that her name will come up again, but there was not just a, hey, we're going to support you or whatever. They really compensated this work. They provided translation and interpretation, transportation and childcare for all in-person activities. They were given access to computers and Wi-Fi so they could participate in the program. So really trying to restore some inequities, but really give people all the tools that they needed to really own and advocate for their community. I'm going to bring up two specific members of this group. I mentioned Maria Jose Gutierrez Paz. She and Jenny Mercado were from this original cohort program. They were facilitators for the second year, so in 2022. Maria Jose is from Bolivia. Only a couple of years ago, she was a professional nature tour guide. She speaks multiple languages, even though maybe not as comfortable with her English. Also speaks French, Spanish, etc. And really is just a great environmental advocate. So this is like a perfect example of a leader that we would love to support their work. Jenny Mercado has a different background. She's from Nicaragua. She's been in Rhode Island for 10 years. She's a CNA at a children's hospital in the emergency room. She's bilingual. She's a mother. Right now, she's prevented against returning to Nicaragua due to activities organizing against the dictatorship there. It's a pretty big thing. So again, community advocacy as a theme, slightly different skill set, has been in the area longer, and really has already become this boundary spanner and translator for their community. So we met them because of these connections we were making with WRWC, and through WRWC made connections directly with Nuevas Voces. One of the things we were really excited about was doing something that was going to make an impact. And for us, making an impact is about finding folks also who are excited to not trying to make a new agenda, but trying to support an existing agenda and making the relationships to do that. And we had to get out of that ivory tower. We had to, we might have had an initial meeting over lunch at ISERM, but the next meeting was we went to the WRWC offices in Olneyville. We got out in the neighborhood and took a walk together along that Woonasquatucket River. And we saw some places where there were restoration efforts. We saw danger and warning signs because of chemicals and dioxins, so don't swim there. We saw areas were pointed out to us where they said in 2010, the flood came up this high. It was really important to get that sense of place. What are we really working for? And there have been some lovely restoration efforts, but it's still important to understand and really know the context. It's not just about this beautiful greenery. It's like the opportunity of this greenery, but then juxtapositioned along these danger, don't swim signs. It's something to really understand. Historically, this river, you can imagine it goes through the capital of a state. It had powered a lot of industry in the Industrial Revolution. And as a result, and later, and because of later activities, it was at one time the most dioxin contaminated waterway in the whole of the United States. So that's really where we're coming back from. The other thing we did, not just about place, but about how we interact. How do we set a power differential? Is it, like, we just want to come in and do this for you? No, it was, we want to listen, we want to understand, we want to offer our resources to you. So whether it was inviting them for lunch, bringing, or going to their neighborhood and us bringing breakfast, we brought Dunkin' Donuts. That's a very Rhode Island thing, coffee and Dunkin' Donuts. We conducted all of our meetings with Nuevas Voces in Spanish. There was a translator available, and that was helpful, but we really wanted to make sure that we were doing all this work in a way that was welcoming to them. And finally, we worked on trying to get compensation. And that's really where the story transitions from ISERM to IMSI because we wanted to help give resources as much as we could. I was able to get some resources through my college to support some stipending for the work of the Nuevas Voces facilitators, but also it went beyond that as well. So we kept in touch over the fall because our time at ISERM was in the summer of 22. And we were working with IMSI, the Math Institute at the University of Chicago, which is the sort of screen behind me. We wanted to accelerate the conversations we were having there to an actual project that would help and support them. So when we asked them this idea about, like, you know, what thing do you have to say over and over again because nobody believes your experience, for example, your experience with the flood, and they were like, yeah, like people think that it's a mansions issue on the coast, that flooding is a mansions issue. No, it's like it's a social justice issue. And so at first we were really thinking, okay, when we come to IMSI, we will work with folks and we'll really like develop this tool that's going to give them this like way to advocate and show all, like the environmental issues that are going on in Providence. But actually that wish list really expanded. It actually became more about holistically, how do we help improve the experience? Jenny inspired us in a lot of ways because she just talked about all the ways that she was helping the community, you know, whether it's, you know, helping new immigrants choose the right school, or helping provide translation support, or, you know, sending people to the resources they needed. And all of that is about being a good neighbor, being a VECINA. It's really hard to tell people you need to go out and like advocate about climate change in your community if you're still like worried about what school your kid is going to pick, or, you know, whether they're going to get fed healthy meals there, and so forth. So our initial conversations from the summer expanded from environmental information, which was still important. And we had things on that initial wish list, like thinking about flooding zones and urban heat maps and green justice zones. And then it started expanding out. And then there was this ask for broad community advocacy information. What are the resources that are in the community that folks can take advantage of? Or when we sat down to figure out what the right translation was for that, for our what we were developing, not resources, it was los fuertes de la comunidad. And what were the schools like? How successful were they or not? Did they have multilingual programs? Some folks talked about heating costs, and like advocating for some heating subsidy programs, especially because of fire risk. And then we talked, it wasn't just about that. We also talked about usability, because usability is so important. So many times we invest so much into creating a model, creating a tool, doing something with our mathematics that we think is interesting, but it's not necessarily useful to an advocacy community. And so we really wanted to focus on making sure that it was going to be useful. So we had these great conversations, you know, when we came together, all of us at IMSI from Nuevas Voces and mathematicians, about like who manages the content of the data, of the list of fuertes de la comunidad. How is that managed? Do they feel comfortable updating some kind of server for this? Or do we have to rely on Google Docs for all of that? And then was it a Google Doc that I start, or was it a Google Doc that it was in the WRWC Google Drive, right? I mean, these sound small, but they're reinforcements of the way that we think about where our data is, who has access to that data, who owns that data, who has control over that data. It's a lot of the conversations that, for me, I've been very inspired, particularly about those in the Indigenous communities because of conversations about Indigenous data sovereignty. So there were those aspects. There are other aspects like, why just data? Like, why not stories? Why not pictures, video? Could it put Spanish language in a more prominent location instead of English? Could it support oral stories? Because the community has very low Spanish literacy rates, or English literacy rates for sure, but even Spanish literacy rates are not as high as one would think. And lastly, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to use good work, open source that was already out there as much as possible. So what started as a small conversation about like advocating for like, yes, flooding is a problem, became a broader, more holistic conversation about what does the community actually need and how do we make sure that it's going to be used. So let me contrast this to kind of what's out there a little bit already and where we are in some of these wish list items. So, for example, environmental information. I'm going to pause my screen share for a second because I'm going to screen share now some other aspects which were or other tools which are environmental information oriented. And if you can see here, this is an example of something called EJ Screen, Environmental Justice Screen. This is a GIS tool by the EPA. Now, on the surface, it looks like, oh, you've got all of the things that you already need to do all that advocacy. So let's look at that. Environmental justice indices, supplemental indices, so we could look at ozone, we could look at lead paint, hazardous waste, pollution. So there's definitely a lot of different things here that might be really useful for some of this work. Climate change data. Here we've got 100-year floodplain. So we're also already starting to see some of the floodplain issues. So this isn't really to the extent that folks have sort of talked about. And in theory, 100-year floodplains are supposed to be coming once every 100 years. That's like from a probability perspective. But there are other issues because in addition to the fact that 100-year floods are now happening much greater frequency due to climate change, we also have poor infrastructure, so it can't drain as well as, in theory, flooded areas should be able to. So that is not expressed on this map. The other thing is that, for example, some things that were brought up to us were, for example, schools. So this is like what we call sort of these polygon layers in many ways, or these sort of areas where you can see something is going on. Here's an ozone map, for example. But there's also another kind of thing called places. So in places, we can look at schools. So that's definitely something that folks said. They said schools were something they were interested in. And so it does point out what are some schools available in the Olneyville area neighborhood. So if we look here, for example, okay, but it doesn't really give us that much information. It tells us William Elementary, not much else. Let's look at something else. Providence Mayoral Middle School. But that's it. It tells us some information, but nothing really important to what a parent might look for, or a prospective parent that's immigrating for their child for school. So there is like a mismatch a little bit between the tools that are available and kind of how overwhelming this is with what that community actually needs. Okay. So we're working on integrating some information from what already exists out there and seeing if we can also add it to our tool, but in a more usable way or subset. And folks can also always visit that later. We have a little bit of some inspiration here. This comes from a project called Chives, which was actually developed at the University of Chicago. It was one of the exciting reasons to be at IMSI in University of Chicago. We had some access to the lab that developed this Chives tool, which does allow you to navigate within Chicago to find out quite a bit of information. This one's a surface temperature, but they also have other things. You can see tree canopy coverage, which is a proxy for urban heat zones, and a number of other things, including floodplains. Unfortunately, the original data source for this is primarily Chicago held and maintained. It's like a Chicago database. And so you can't just change the zip code and then all of a sudden everything shows up for Providence. It's actually a much more complicated problem from a data streams perspective than that. Okay, so remember I talked about that places piece. So one of the things that we wanted to talk to folks, or that folks wanted to bring up as a tool that's useful for our community should have, right? They should have these community advocacy resources. So way back, I think in the 2021 cohort year that Jenny and Maria Jose were both part of, they actually developed a whole list of some community resources. And somebody had put this together in an ArcGIS story map, which is kind of interesting. This is their story map. I love the little icons here. It's great. But again, the person who had put that together, I think, was maybe an intern. Nobody knew that it actually existed. They didn't know how to have access to it to change the database. And the information that's inside is not really that usable. Object ID, this is a park, this is a location, that's it. It doesn't really have any information. Why is this a resource? So we built a slightly different version. So I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna sort of exit out of this, and I'm going to show you our version of the same kind of thing. So let's see. So this is our version. This is built on a completely open platform called Leaflet, which is, so it's not ArcGIS in the sense that you don't need like a very expensive software to implement this. Little things happen along the way. For example, Nuevas Voces didn't have any kind of like logo. So we just kind of created something with them for them. And they're like, yeah, that's good. We tried to put Spanish first. So you'll notice that as we scroll through, you'll see Spanish is an asset. Here's the map. I'm going to just scroll down to the very first thing. And you'll see this is Nuevas Voces. You can see the description. And this actually has an audio, so it'll read out to you. I don't know if I've shared the audio here. So let me pause, let me stop share, and let me do a computer audio sharing so that you can actually hear this. Okay, so just redo that so that you can hear with the sound. Oops.
La Asociación de Vecinos de Olneyville, ONA, comenzó de manera informal en la década de 1990, ubicada en una iglesia local, como un foro para los vecinos de uno de los barrios más marginados de Rhode Island para abordar las condiciones de vida cotidiana.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? So this is really exciting for us to be able to build in some of this functionality that we were working from a template from Leaflet. We chose this particular thing because it could read from Google Docs, and we had to set up all the APIs for it to do that. And we created those original Google Docs within the WRWC organization. And then there were other features that we had to add, like it didn't have fields to put both Spanish and then you can see afterwards English translation. It didn't have a button that could do the verbal transcript readout. So that was all really, really exciting to be able to add new functionality to an existing tool and be able to share that functionality back with the community. So this is all shared on GitHub. So you can sort of see so it's sort of giving back not just to the Providence community, but I hope to the entire data justice development community. Okay. The other thing I want to note is that at first, when we were talking about pictures, we were going to add like the pictures of the buildings. This was like something I was like, oh yeah, just like let's grab pictures of the building so that people can recognize it. And people are like, no, we're not going to add a picture. We don't have pictures of the buildings. We have pictures of the people in the buildings. And I was like, yes, you are absolutely right. That is the picture of the Olneyville Neighborhood Association, not the door that they meet at. Okay, let me show you just another project. This one, so I'm kind of showing you snapshots. Some of this presentation was stuff that was actually presented at the end of our time at IMSI. So lots of folks, I hear the voices of all my collaborators with me right now. And you can see that if you want to, you can see that full presentation on the IMSI website. But I'll take you through like a little bit of what Victor did. This was inspired by Jenny, who had at the time been thinking about how to help an immigrant family living with her that was currently enrolling their child in school. And they had to choose a middle school. And there is like this quasi lottery system. So you kind of have school choice, but you kind of don't. Like there is a 20% chance you can go somewhere else. Otherwise, you're stuck to schools within a 1 mile radius. But even, which one do you select is not necessarily clear. So her concern was that the family that she was helping, the child was currently just kind of put into a school right now and is miserable. They have no idea what's going on. They don't have any real support for somebody that does not speak English. And so she was like, what's important to me when I look at these schools, I want to know like which ones have ELL programs or multilingual learner programs. And it's not that clear from, just, clicking, if you go to greatschools.com or any of these other kinds of websites, even the school websites, it's not clear who has what. And that's a lot of time to go and do that kind of investigation. Okay. So could we help them with that issue? And then like whether they have a program or not may not be the only consideration. Are they doing well with ELL students? Are they really supporting ELL students? And so there's also some data, available from the city of Providence through their open data portal. There's also an education data portal. But again, this is pretty overwhelming. If someone wants to go and do further research, it's great that these resources are available. But from a user community perspective, this is not really giving you the information you need. So here's an alternate view that Victor Piercy was working on in response to Jenny, sharing all of these needs. And first, one thing I want to point out is see this little box right here for Espanol. That was to indicate support of some kind of bilingual programming or Spanish intensive, more Spanish intensive program. And or dual language immersion, I think is the case in this particular Gilbert school. But that icon didn't exist. I mean, that was also something we kind of like, oh, Jenny, like what would be a good way to sort of visually cue this is like a program that, you know, would really support dual language learning or something like that. And so we kind of showed a couple of prototypes and she picked that one. And so I wanted like even little things that look sort of small to us are actually big, right? These are graphs comparing success of ELL and non-ELL students. You'll notice that the y-axis here is meets or exceeds. These are state standard levels. You'll notice that everything is pretty small at only 30%. So only 30% of students, if they were filling the top of this, would be meeting those standards. And the statewide average is the dark line. Statewide ELL, non-ELL and ELL. And we can see already huge disparities in who is achieving even mediocre amounts of outcomes in these schools. And these are all schools in all of Providence, And it should be no surprise that some of the schools that are doing well for some students are actually located near Brown University, whereas these are not so much there. So I think it was kind of when we put this all up, we're like, these are all the middle schools in Providence and they all are not doing great. That's really important to know. And Jenny was like, yeah, didn't you know Providence schools were failing so badly that the state had to take them over? So this is us finding out something new about Providence, but then also she knew this already. I don't know that the community realized that it was this bad. We're talking like only less than 10% of all students are meeting or exceeding standards. I mean, at least the gap is narrower here, but the overall success rate is terrible. So there are some real issues here. And how are we helping maybe bring some of these issues to light? But also this also was a great conversation piece. She said, well, you know, there are some schools we know we want to sort of stay away from. And there are some schools that might be doing an okay job being sort of at least not terrible for some of this. So that was kind of, you know, okay, well, do you want to send your school to this, which has like a really good overall at least from a testing perspective, and good is sort of a relative term, but for this school but notice the disparity is too much, or, you know, really, if you're just looking at the orange, like maybe Gilbert is actually outperforming, and so maybe is ESIC, and Gilbert has the Spanish immersive, so maybe this is the better choice. But like, I mean, I think keeping to push on that or really work through that is important. It's important to know also that like the charter schools are not part of this particular data set, and the private schools, and there is a private school that's right next to Brown University, and so there's a significant number of folks who just have their kids also in private schools. So just seeing this landscape like this, it's pretty sad to see. But on the other hand, we feel like, you know, Jenny really felt like she had some tools to make some better and more informed decisions now. So next steps, we're done with our sort of Providence Accelerator. We have the tools that we needed in order to sort of start developing these small aspects of an overall tool. They have not been integrated yet. So, of course, we do want to also do flood zone maps, and we want to have the information about the fuertes and the schools. So there's really like an integration thing that we have to work on next. Atilio Barreda is one of the folks that's really involved in some of those next steps from an software infrastructure side. And we're just going to continue working on that. We're returning to Providence next summer, which is really exciting. We're hoping to, continue to meet in person and work on, hopefully we'll have a more full beta test of the entire set of tools together, an integrated tool set together, and work on a white paper or something to sort of say, here's what we can learn from the tool. I'll also point out that we named our tool VECINA, sort of inspired by Jenny. This stands for Visualizing Environmental and Community Information for Neighborhood Advocacy. So this has been like really, really cool project overall. We just actually released a podcast with IMSI today. And today, so for reference, if folks are watching this later, it's September 28th. So if you go on today, there is now a podcast that really uses the voices of the entire team. I think you're going to get a much more full perspective about what the project's about and how do people think about what it's like to do this community engaged work, rather than just hearing it from my more like project overview lens. But I encourage you to check that out. If you go to any of your favorite Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever your podcast deliverer platform is, and look for Carrie the Two, not Carrie like my name, but Carry, Carrie the Two. And you'll look for the episode that dropped on February 28th, and you can hear a lot more about it. So we hope to be bringing you more and updated work in the future. And I look forward to a community conversation at Café con Leche. I also want to leave folks with a sort of like sense of, beside this particular program at Nuevas Voces, what could it mean moving forward for the way we think about practicing community-driven research or engaging as mathematicians in questions that are important to communities. I think sometimes it's easier to work on questions about, say, social justice in the mathematics community or in our classroom community, because those are ecosystems that we know well, and we might have a little more agency or control over it. I think it's a lot harder to build relationships with groups that you don't know, and it takes time, a lot of time. But they can be so impactful and wonderful. But allow that time. Don't try to say, oh, we're going to learn a community partner in week 1, and then we're going to do the project in week 2. I mean, really, like I said, the setup to work at IMSI was almost a year between making some initial contacts before we even got at ISERM to meeting with folks while we were at ISERM and on. Feel like it has to be based in a mutual trust and respect. The work has to be relational, really, really humanized. I mean, really thinking about who people are and what their needs are, thinking about the place in which they're located. I'd like to encourage folks to think about these as sustained and not a one-off. I think they can be sort of short-term projects if you're working within a framework of an organization like a community engagement center that does have a long-standing relationship that you can leverage, or you have collaborators with long-standing relationships that you can leverage. You can be a little bit more transient in your work, or if you're in a big group of people and together it is a long relationship. But I think one of the really nice things about really owning the project together and working together and building this relationship together is that Jenny said this later in her reflection on the Carry the Two podcast. She said like she felt like mathematicians cared about them, and she was going to go home and tell her girls how cool mathematicians were. And I was like, wow, that's a really great opportunity. And like, by engaging in this work with the community, it was such a great time to sort of like validate all of the things that like Jenny and Maria Jose were bringing to the table. They, in their podcast episode, they were like, well, what are we going to bring? We're just working with a bunch of PhDs and they know all this stuff. And I was like, no, it's not how it works. Like, they knew all this stuff. We just were trying to add a particular skill set to support all the things that they knew. But by doing so, they also learned, we were also teaching each other different things. They were teaching us about Providence and about the Providence school system and about the needs and the things that they face all the time and the way that they work in the community and what kind of advice they give to people and resources they send them to. And we were teaching them about like, oh, this is how to change this setting in Google Docs, and here's how to put together like a PowerPoint. And those were little things that maybe we took for granted, but we were help both building each other better. So that kind of democracy with that mutual beneficial co-education, it was just such a pleasure. And so I would love to encourage other folks to engage in this kind of social justice work with that real partnership intention. So thank you. I feel like there's so much potential for this work moving forward. I'm so happy to be supporting some of this through the time I was at ICERN, but really substantially at IMSI, and for their support of this project and for the invitation from Café con Leche. Thank you, everyone.